G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today I want to look at the recent changes with Warhammer World, 3D printing, and I want to quickly touch upon some of Games Workshop's legal stuff, their intellectual property policy, and some interesting things that happened in the Chapter House lawsuit that I want to revisit, because we don't get much coverage of it, and I think it's kind of important to understand it. So, what happened recently was they put out a requirement that miniatures must contain only Games Workshop parts or sort of blank materials such as brass, plastic card, green stuff that you have personally modelled in order to create the models that you're putting on the table. And these conversions must be approved by their events team prior to use. And I'm not against this. I'm not against it. It's entirely their prerogative. You're playing in their event area at their event, and they want to showcase their miniatures. So that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable behaviour. However, that being said, is it a wise decision? Probably not, in my opinion, because you're cutting down on the creativity of the community. For years, if people want to represent, say, female guard forces, as an example, they could just use some head swaps onto regular male guard bodies, because performing female head swaps with Games Workshop's products and converting them obviously featured a lot of difficulty. Well, those particular armies now will technically not fit into these requirements here, specifically this section down here. And that's very interesting to note, because you can't really expect people to go back and rip all the heads off their army and put new heads on them and then rock up to the events. I think that's just a bridge too far to push it with the community. Same thing goes for armies where they might have converted them up, say, thinking out loud here, prior to Games Workshop's updating of the Primaris range. Very few upgrades or conversion parts were provided for many Space Marine chapters or Chaos Space Marine legions. This meant that people went to a lot of third-party sellers to get parts, to get bits, especially if what they did have available went out of production at Games Workshop. Then it was the only way in order to build certain forces. Well, now with this decision, it penalises those people who were trying to represent a thematic force. So I don't agree with it on those grounds. I also think it's a bit rich that, things like 3D printing is frowned upon by them, but only when it's 3D printed by the individual. And specifically, they say some very interesting things. Like, if you print it for yourself and use it on your miniature, well, that's okay. But if a friend prints it for you and gives it to you, well, that's not okay. Well, how do you judge that? How can you tell if a person printed it for themselves or not? It's a very strange set of criteria, and we'll get into it more when we look at their intellectual property policy in a moment. But it's all stuff that I immediately raise an eyebrow to, like, how are you going to police this? Are you, velvet glove or iron fist? There's only one of those things it can really be. It's very hard to be in the middle on it. And if it gets extra hard where I've seen 3D printed miniatures which are indistinguishable from what Games Workshop did. And what happens in that circumstance? What about recasts? Someone could potentially rock up with a recast army. Games Workshop's none the wiser. Someone rocks up with a legitimate Games Workshop army, but they used the wrong heads or the wrong shoulder pads on them, and then they're the ones who get the no-no and get told they can't play at the event. Meanwhile, the recast army gets to play at the event. There's a certain irony in there, I think. So the whole thing's a bit fishy to me on those levels. So, moving away from that, the intellectual property policy. Very interesting to see. So, Games Workshop likes to slap copyright strikes on things. This is true, and in the past they were pretty litigious. Things have changed a little bit, and I want to go through these sections because I think there's some interesting stuff to note. So, firstly, if you're producing content that involves Games Workshop related stuff, they don't want you to make money off it. Okay, fair enough. what they're saying there is don't go out and say cosplay as a Sister of Battle and then have people pay you to do so. Again, not sure how they police that one, but that's interesting. Then they've got no professional distribution. Please do not professionally distribute, whether free of charge or for payment, anything you have produced which contains our IP. So if you do some fan art, for instance, of Games Workshop, say you paint a drawing of, or paint or draw a picture of a ultramarine, and you give it away to people, technically that's not allowed according to their Celebrating the Hobby initiative here. Do not damage our brand. Please avoid anything which may be prejudicial to the goodwill, reputation, image, or prestige of our IP. Well, unfortunately, what's fine to one person is unacceptable to others, so that's a very open basket. Make it clear that what you're doing is entirely unofficial. Okay, so it's another interesting one. They say here, don't use, say, the Warhammer Club or spacehulk.com, for example. Instead, create your own names, such as Hellfire Hunters or cleanseandburn.com, or other far more creative names, they say. That's interesting. So you could have a fan site dedicated to, say, Space Hulk, and you call it spacehulk.com because it's not a registered domain. Games Workshop wants to waggle the finger at you, except the problem is they can't, because all of these things listed here are guidelines. It's their ideal, look, we can't enforce it by law, but can you please just not do this? Use trademarks appropriately. We spend a lot of time getting our trademarks to look how we want them. Please do not stretch or alter our trademarks. So, up the top here says Games Workshop. They don't want you to take that Games Workshop logo and stretch it out. Okay. If it's transformative, I will. Copyright. Do not use material protected by copyright. Please don't use images from our website, chunks of text lifted from our publications, or any of our artwork. We'd encourage you to instead write your own descriptions and maybe even draw your own pictures and maps. Never distribute copies of our publications or other protected material for free. Yeah, fair enough. But again, this is skirting around the law. The law says you can use images directly from their website. And you can lift whole sections of publication as long as the work is transformative. So you can't just go take their book, post it up as a free PDF. Understand that. But you could post up pictures, some of the rules content. You could technically post up all of the rules content if you wanted, as long as what you were doing with it was transformative. So you're describing it, going through the rules, this is how they work, here's some pros, here's some cons. Perfectly acceptable stuff. Because you're not going out of your way to say, hey, here's the rules, and adding nothing to it. You're creating its own derivative work because of that. And that is protected under law. And it can be very, very little that you have to do with it for it to become a derivative work. The Sargon of Akkad versus Aquila Hughes is a great example of that, where I'm pretty sure what he did was he just showed a video that he edited up slightly. No commentary, no voiceover, anything like that. And it was just clips taken from her own video to portray her as a hypocrite of sorts. And she took him to court over it and lost incredibly brutally in the court decision, to the point where she had to pay all of his legal fees because they ruled that no, it was transformative. Moving on to derivative works. Be aware that if you use our copyright-protected material to make something else than the thing you make, it will be a derivative work. You should not claim that anyone other than Games Workshop owns copyright over Games Workshop-owned IP or derivatives of it. They can't own derivatives of their IP. They are exactly that. They're a derivative. It would be like the people who made 2000 AD claiming that Games Workshop ripped off the Adeptus Arbites from them. They're clearly derivative of Judge Dredd and the judges of that universe. Therefore, they own Games Workshop's Adeptus Arbites IP. That's not how any of that works. So if you draw a picture or write a story and includes Blood Angels fighting Tyranids or Gotrek and Felix characters or any other protected elements, then Games Workshop owns rights in those works, and therefore you cannot go off and sell your prints or your picture or copies of your story I'm going to add a little line in there, unless you're Disney, because you're richer than us. People might be familiar with them using Space Marines, grav tanks, and bolt guns in a few of their stories. Very funny. Obviously, Games Workshop did not take Disney to court. Don't share unreleased material. We love people talking about our products once they've been announced. Discussing rumours is great too, but leaking material is not. We have the right to first release of our copyrighted material. If you receive any material before we announce it, keep it secret, keep it safe, and we'll tell people about it when we are ready. We would also ask that you report any leaked material to us at infringements@gamesworkshopplc.com so that we can identify where the material originated from. No, you don't have the right to first release. It's a privilege. And unlike rights, privileges can be taken away. And I'm not trying to say this to be a prick, it's just that's the world we live in. Again, these are all guidelines. Games Workshop is using guidelines and trying to write language here in their jargon that says these guidelines are strict and these are enforceable, is the way they word the language. But again, you have to refer back to the top of the page where it says, well, actually, no, these are guidelines. Okay, but they use authoritative words in their text to try and convince people that they can't do things. So if you look at this, many of these things have been broken on our channel. We've said things about them that are not very nice. We talk about them, which generates us an income, technically. We use their trademarks inappropriately because we modify them or edit them or whatever in the point of making a derivative work. And Games Workshop doesn't own those derivative works, and we show their copyrighted material because we're directly talking about it and creating something new with that material in order to create a derivative work. And we will share unreleased material because sometimes it's all we have to keep a little bit of hope in the community. For example, Plastic Heresy. If a new Heresy box set is coming after all the other box sets were pulled from production 2 years ago, that's kind of a big deal, and it gives a bit of hope to the community. So you bet your ass we're going to talk about it. Then they go on to say, non-commercial recasting and 3D printing. Do not cast or scan any materials based on Games Workshop's IP. Reproduction for personal use is not an automatic exemption from copyright protection in many territories worldwide. List them. Likewise, do not produce and distribute designs which substantially copy Games Workshop's products. See imitations below. Very interesting one. Reproduction for personal use is not an automatic exemption from copyright protection in many territories worldwide. I'm curious what territories that is, because if you can make something, even if it directly copies someone else's thing, but you can make it for yourself, and it's only for you, I'm pretty sure that violates absolutely zero laws. There are laws within countries that might say, to use an extreme example, you can't go make an atomic bomb for yourself. But the reason it is banned is not because you're copying, say, the US copyright on the B-82 atomic warhead. No, the reason they don't want you to do it is because they don't want an atomic bomb in the hands of an individual. Fair enough. Let's say you have a car engine and you decide that you want some new pistons in that engine, and you decide, because you're a madman and you've got the machinery, that you're going to machine up those pistons yourself. You're going to buy your own aluminium billets, you machine them up in your lathe, you then put these pistons into your engine block. You've not broken any rules by doing so. Even if they are down to the 100th of a millimeter identical to what another manufacturer could make, you've not broken any rules there. You would be breaking rules or laws if you were to on-sell that product. But again, look at the car market. The car market's a great market to go off because so many products are visually, metallurgically similar to one another that, you can go to China, to the Middle East, you can go to pretty much anywhere in the world and get parts for name brand cars that are just knockoff parts. It's just so commonplace in that industry. They also say, please do not contact us asking for specific permissions. We do not give express permissions except in respect of licenses. See licensing below. But as long as you're celebrating the hobby in accordance with this policy, we are unlikely to object to your use of our intellectual property. Which is fine. Fair enough. They can't respond to every single person saying, hey, I want to use a picture of your Space Marine in my video. That's going to be way too tedious for them. That said, they've laid out a set of guidelines. Are they protecting their copyright sufficiently with those guidelines? I'm not sure. But interesting point here is counterfeiting. We take counterfeiting very seriously as it ruins the hobby for everyone. Counterfeiters take advantage of our hobbyists and devalue both our products and your collections. We're committed to taking action against counterfeiters and to supporting victims of counterfeiting. If you've been a victim of counterfeiting, then please let us know by emailing them. See, counterfeiting is obviously talking about recasts here. The problem with recasts is, does it devalue Games Workshop's product? The only thing that I've noticed devalues Games Workshop's product is if you buy it and want to sell it on. A great example of this is if you go to Games Workshop and you buy a Tactical Squad. That Tactical Squad is new in box and it costs 72 Australian dollars. You then want to go and sell it on to someone else. Nobody's going to pay you $70 for that box. That's what it's worth. That's what you paid for it. It's still brand new in box. It's still wrapped in the shrink wrap. People don't care. They don't want to pay $72 for it. They want to pay $50, something like that. And they go, oh yeah, it's a bit of a discount. They do not want to pay Games Workshop regular retail price. It's an interesting situation where the thing that devalues the models is purchasing them. It's kind of like a car in a lot of ways. The minute you drive out the dealership, it loses 50% of its value type thing. Well, the minute you buy a box from Games Workshop, even if you never try and do anything with it, you've just lost a third of the money you spent on it, which is crazy. There are ways of getting that number back up, like you take them out of the box, you build them, you paint them to a high standard, you might be able to sell them for more. But that is what I would call unlikely situation. I know many people, including myself, who have tried to sell armies in the past where we've tried to sell them essentially at what it cost us. Once we go like what it cost in resin from, say, Forge World or plastic from Games Workshop, combined with the paints and materials, super glue, plastic glues, whatever, to paint the force. We're not even charging for the time that we took to paint the armies. We try and sell them, then people are asking us for less than retail price for these armies. It's like, hang on, you can't even paint an army to this standard, and you want to pay for a built and painted army less than you would pay for it if it was still on sprues in a box. It's insane. So I don't know how counterfeiting devalues the product. The only thing that devalues the product is purchasing the product. Imitations. Another funny one. So producing copies of Games Workshop's creations is an infringement of copyright. This includes copying a significant part of our creations. Making models which copy heavily from Games Workshop's artwork, descriptions of products is therefore an infringement. Is it instantly recognizable by the Games Workshop's unique characters, creatures, or vehicles? If so, it has likely copied a significant part and is therefore an infringement. Just because we haven't got around to making the model yet doesn't mean you can. That's not legally true. And I want to show people why when we move on in just a moment. Using Games Workshop's trademarks to name or identify products that were not created by Games Workshop is an infringement of our trademarks. It is very misleading as it sometimes suggests something is Games Workshop product when it is not. Please ensure you do not use Games Workshop's trademarks in product titles, category headings, adverts, etc. So that is very interesting because in the Chapter House lawsuit, and I won't go through all of these, but what I will do is take you to this page here. So this is part of the long list that Games Workshop put together of all the things that they felt Chapter House copied from them in their lawsuit. And I know it's a dry episode today, guys. I do apologise. But it's interesting to note the things they tried to copyright. So one of the things that Chapter House did in their lawsuit was in claiming the fair use of the products, they actually essentially claimed that what they were doing was often letting people know what a part worked in conjunction with. So that judgment, as best I read the lawsuit, passed in their favour. And Games Workshop saying that someone can't call something after Games Workshop's product is also kind of true. Now, this is confusing, but I'll put it another way. If Chapter House, for instance, says, Salamander shoulder pads, all right, for a set of shoulder pads, that's infringing on Games Workshop's intellectual property because they've said they are Salamander's shoulder pads. They're claiming they're a Games Workshop Salamander product, therefore. However, if they say Fire Drake shoulder pads, or Fire Dragon shoulder pads, and then under it write a little line that says, these shoulder pads are compatible with Games Workshop's Space Marines Salamander chapter. That is fine. And that's what the judge agreed, because they are describing what the product works in conjunction with. It's the same as having a bottle of Coke at home, and you buy a bottle cap for it. I don't know why you would, but you buy a separate bottle cap. Maybe it's made of some fancy material like titanium. And it says, this is a titanium bottle cap, and it works in conjunction with bottles of Coca-Cola. Perfectly legal that you've used Coca-Cola's name there because you're identifying the product that it works with. That is a fair description of the product and protected under law. And Chapter House won that part of the lawsuit. What they lost was if they turned around and said, Coca-Cola bottle cap for their part. You see, that's the difference. If you say, Chapter House says Chimera tank turret. Boom, boom, illegal. You've called it a Chimera tank turret. However, they say tank turret, and then underneath right, fits Chimera battle tank from Games Workshop. Legal. Okay? Big distinction there. Some of the things that Chapter House and Games Workshop had listed before you. So, for example, Games Workshop claimed that they used some of these things like Hellbird, grenade launcher, jet bike, plasma. What? None of those things are copyrighted intellectual property of Games Workshop. The Hellbird is a weapon that dates from medieval time period in Europe. You can't copyright that. Same as broadswords, okay? Or cogs. Symbology, one of the things Games Workshop picked out and had to retract their claim on was this. This is one of the things that they tried to claim they own the copyright to. This is Games Workshop intellectual property, and this is one of the items they sued Chapter House over. They made shoulder pads with this symbol on there. That's insanity. There were some, though, like the Tau symbol. Okay, that was a more unique Games Workshop design. Therefore, that one they could claim. It's a weird thing. Roman numerals combined with arrows. Like really obscure things they tried to claim in this lawsuit, and they lost on many of these things. Because, scarab beetles, something that you see carved in Egyptian pyramids on the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun. No, you can't claim this stuff as you owning it. And I highly encourage people to actually read through some of the things that Games Workshop actually was claiming. Like, it's insane. And it goes back to one of these ones here where they say that just because we haven't got around to making the model yet doesn't mean you can. This is what the crux of the lawsuit actually revolved around. Games Workshop described many products in their codexes and rulebooks for different factions. A great example of that might be the Mycetic Spore for the Tyranids. And they didn't make a model for it. And after about 5 years of not making a model for it, Chapter House made a model for it. And then Games Workshop tried to sue them for it and said, no, we own Mycetic Spores. And the judge turned around and went, okay, where's your Mycetic Spore model that you have for sale to the general public? And they lost on that point of the lawsuit because they can't just turn around and say we own something because we have a rough conceptual idea for it. Okay, it's very different to owning something because you have a patent on it or you have an actual intellectual property claim on it. And how you generate those claims is a long-winded process, and you need to have a long history of behind them. But anyway, so what they could nail them on was you can't call it a mycetic spore. Perfectly acceptable. You can call it a alien space seed pod. Perfectly acceptable. But calling it a mycetic spore is a no, because it's directly copying the name of the Games Workshop product, and that is infringing upon the IP because the IP is directly written in their codex. It's a really weird world that we live in here. So Games Workshop can't just claim that, they wrote rules for something and therefore they own all the rights to it. Another example you could use of that is in Book 9, they released rules for a new type of bike and jet bike unit for the Horus Heresy. They do not produce models for those. Yes, they produce bike and jet bike models, but they do not have the correct war gear on those bikes. Therefore, if someone was to come along and make something that looks functionally very similar, or just a straight up weapon swap for those vehicles in order to allow you to equip them so that they match the rules as written, Games Workshop cannot sue them for infringement or directly copying their product because they don't make that product. They don't make those weapons. They wrote a line about them in a book. That is not enough to say that you own that thing. And if that was enough to say that you own many of these things, they'd be fucked as a company because they stole all their ideas and derived them from other people. They took the fantasy races of Tolkien. They took Cthulhu mythos stuff. They took stuff from 2000 AD, from Alien, from Terminator, from Heinlein's Starship Troopers, and they combined it all to create their own IP. And that's perfectly fine. It is fine to take concepts from other worlds and pull them into your own and expand upon them. Nothing wrong with that. Perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable behavior. But it's a real shame to see how hard they clamp down on people, and in the end, Chapter House, I think, went bust, but they won the majority of the lawsuit. What really did hurt them was where they used the names of Games Workshop products in the title of the unit. Predator replacement armor is very different to saying tank upgrade armor compatible with Games Workshop PLC's Predator chassis. They won things like halberds and pauldrons and Terminator and, upside down letter V's or lambdas. They won this on the lawsuit. It's just a real shame that Games Workshop is so bitterly litigious. And I understand businesses have to demonstrate that they're actively going out of their way to protect their copyright, but Games Workshop can be a little bit excessive with how they do it, to put it lightly, and it has often bitten them in the butt. And this lawsuit did bite them in the butt. They actually took a big share hit. Now, the upside of the lawsuit was that Kevin Roundtree came in about the same time and spent the next 4 years or more essentially responding to many of the community's biggest complaints. Now, they didn't fix things like prices, and yeah, they pulled a lot of codexes and a lot of units from codexes because of the fact that they didn't have models for them, and they lost on them in the lawsuit. Therefore, as a sheer act of spite, they pulled those units. But it meant that they had to start to respond and deliver some things to the community. So, okay, mycetic spores went, but they got the Tyrannocyte pod instead. So they did get the mycetic spore back. It took some time, but they got there. And it has meant a turnaround, and now armies that didn't get touched, units that had entries but never got models, has slowly started to turn around, where now those things are being filled out where possible. The only downside is that for some factions, they sat in limbo for a very long time because Games Workshop was like, okay, we need to create models for the units we don't have, and they focused a lot of energy in that direction. But it meant the units that were serviceable, like, say, Eldar Guardians, or some of the Eldar Exarchs, and different types of orcs, a lot of that stuff stayed in production without getting updated, I think for that reason, because if you've got resources you need to devote to creating new products, you're not going to go back necessarily and rejig the old ones. And we're only just seeing a new version of the Orcs after nearly 30 years. We're going to be seeing a new, hopefully new set of Guardians in the next probably 2 years, at a guess. So it might work out for us in the end. But it's very interesting to see how, we've gotten to the stage here where they're saying we don't want to see alternate heads on miniatures. And look, like I said at the start, I'm fine with them. You're in their house playing the game and they say, we don't want to see 3D prints and heads from alternate manufacturers. Fine, that's a perfectly legal and legitimate call to make on their end. They want to sell their product and advertise their product. Fine. Okay. However, it stymies the creativity in the community and it's not fostering the hobby as much as it is fostering Games Workshop's bank account. They're fine with 3D printed products as long as it's them producing the 3D prints. And what people seem to fail to understand is that Forge World 3D prints their masters. They don't 3D print the model that comes to your doorstep, but the problem is, when you 3D print a master and you make a mold of it, you're making a mold of a 3D printed product, which is the same as how many companies manufacture their models. They 3D print them as well, or maybe they hand sculpt them, and then they make a mold of that original master model. And so, at the end of the day, it may be made of a homogeneous resin that was poured into a mold, but it's still the mold of a 3D printed part, and there's a certain irony to be found in it. Games Workshop doesn't make 3D printed models. Games Workshop uses the same modeling technology that creates their 3D printed models to machine the molds and the dies for their models to a very high accuracy. There's a slight difference there. Anyway, back at the outer circle. Dry episode, I know, but it's just interesting. And go through. Have a look at, in case text, through the Games Workshop Chapter House lawsuit here. And go in and look at the GW response facts in their claim. And just look through the articles and read it for the sheer lunacy of what it entails, and you will understand why out of something like 130 claims, they lost about 100 of them. Very interesting stuff. Also, they don't own the copyright to this, it turns out. Very interesting stuff. Back with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.